Here you go. Welcome back to Senate Education, Friday, March 31st. We're in receipt of a letter, mascot complaint statement. And I believe if I were to summarize those that have signed it are largely members of our social equity caucus, along with others. And so we have Mr. Fisher in from the Agency of Education to talk to us about the model policy on non-discriminatory mascots and school branding that this committee passed out and the Senate and House approved and the governor signed last year. So with that, Mr. Fisher.
For the record, Ted Fisher from my Agency of Education. I'm the agency's Director of Communications and Legislative Affairs. Just thank you for the opportunity to come in and provide you with a status update. I have provided similar updates, and I also have a slide deck which I'm happy to share with the committee that is dated February to the Social Equity Caucus and others on the work related to Act 152. I would like to note I understand that the committee might have questions about some of the concerns raised by various groups in Vermont, and the agency will I may be able to comment on some of those, and I may not be. And the reason for that is that, as we'll get into here, the Secretary of Education is part of the process and actually is the appeals process outlined in statute in Act 152. And as an instrument and agent of the Secretary, it would be potentially prejudicial to a hearing or a complaint for us to reference some of the specific complaints about schools. So we're part of that process. My plan would be to give you a little bit of an update as we have some new committee members of what Act 152 does and what has happened since passage in June. And then we can maybe get towards what some of the concerns are. I'll do my best to answer, like I said, within a construct of we're part of the due process that you established in the Act. But firstly, I'll just note that the legislative intent and the background of this is in response to several instances of fraught conversations about school branding that have occurred in Vermont school districts. We've had some instances where changes of school board mean that school districts' approach to branding or mascots and approach to these conversations shift over time. In some cases, they have shifted in one direction and then shifted back, and that has caused concern and discord in some Vermont communities. In response, the General Assembly passed Act 152 last year, which requires school district to adopt and abide by a policy on non-discriminatory school branding, which includes the use of mascots and other symbols. It establishes a uniform minimum standards for non-discriminating branding policies, places important guardrails on district and community conversations, and establishes a process for Vermonters to bring concerns first to their local school board and the state. I just want to say that the agency fully supports the concept and the legislative intent of Act 152, which I don't really include in full in this, but you can find in the language, it's Section 1. We believe that no Vermont student should have to attend a school whose identity, visual brand marks, mascot, or other representative symbology discriminates, oppresses, marginalized, or is otherwise offensive to the student's culture, tradition, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And we believe that the bill strikes the right balance between the authority and responsibilities of a local Vermont school board under law and the state's interest in safeguarding students. I want to stress that it's still early in the implementation of the law. I include a timeline in my testimony, and I'd love to go over it in whatever detail you'd like. There's not any indication from our perspective that the bill is failing or the law is failing to achieve its effect. But before we get into that, I did provide you, because I do have a link, I did provide you a handout, the model policy on non-discriminating school mascots and school branding. That is the policy that you require in Section 2 of Act 152, which adds a provision to Title 16, which requires school boards to adopt a non-discriminatory school branding policy that is at least as comprehensive as a model policy developed by AOE. The policy applies to both Vermont public schools, that's really important to stress, and independent schools. And the definition of school board in the Act is a little bit different from what you might normally see under Title 16. It includes the board of directors of an independent school in this provision. So to dive into the nitty-gritty, the new section of Title 16, which is Section 568, requires the Secretary of Education to develop and adopt the model non-discriminatory school branding policy. It prohibits branding that references stereotypes, characteristics specific to race, creed, color, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or any person, group, organization associated with repression. And it includes a policy for process for filing a complaint to the school board if an individual believes that an element of school branding process, school branding violates the policy, excuse me. And then if the school board is required to act, if it acts and either fails to act, or if the person bringing the complaint is unsatisfied with the resolution of the act, they may appeal to the Secretary of Education for review of that decision.
And how much time did we give districts to come up with their new policy?
That is an excellent question. If you could drop down to implementation timeline on the bottom of page 2, the deadlines in the act.
I'm sorry, do I have the same?
There's 3 different.
Sorry, this is the model. This is the model policy. I apologize. My testimony. I apologize.
There we go. Okay.
So you go to the bottom of page 2. The deadline for AOE to adopt the model policy was August 1st. I have
Oh, there we go.
copy.
Got it. Thank you.
Sorry. So, and there was also a requirement for consultation. The AOE posted a draft for public comment on July 1 of last year. Received some public comment and then issued the policy on August 1st. There was a requirement for school boards to review their current branding in place as of the passage of the act and the issuance of the policy. And the deadline for school boards to adopt a non-discriminatory branding policy that, again, is at least as comprehensive, provides this nice minimum floor by January 1st. Something that we missed up here that I just want to stress briefly is that if the school board fails to adopt this policy, as in they don't act or they refuse to act, they're assumed to have adopted our model policy. So that also provides a useful assurance. If they don't take action at the district level to do so, we're going to judge them based on this. If there's a complaint that governs us.
So who's the judge in this? Who's going to determine if they've gone far enough or didn't take necessary action?
That's an excellent question. So there are 2 places just above the implementation timeline in AOE model policy. Our model policy adds some responsibilities for superintendents. It's a little bit easier to read in this bulleted list on the model policy. There's a twofold complaints process. The first complaint is to a local school board. With the school board, again, they have to create this policy. They need to review their school branding based on the new policy. It has to be at least as stringent as the statewide policy developed by AOE. And then the requirement is that if there's a complaint, they have to hear the complaint. We have in our policy a requirement that they hear the complaint publicly. So that would be most likely at a school board meeting, although I'm sure they could call an extraordinary meeting if they wish to do so. And then they have to act. And in the model policy, we give them 45 days of the hearing. Again, it must be at least as comprehensive. So the school boards could act more quickly. They can't act less quickly. So 45 days of hearing, they have to provide a summary of facts and a basis for the decision. At that point, if someone who brings a complaint is unsatisfied or a community group is unsatisfied with the decision made by the school board, their appeal is to the Secretary of Education.
Did I answer your questions?
It does.
Okay. Senator Chief.
At the bottom of page 2 and going on to the top of page 3, and I apologize if you covered this already, but there's a deadline for school boards to adopt non-discriminatory branding policy by January 1st, and then there's the deadline for schools to select policy compliant branding by May 1st, 2023. So I guess kind of 2 questions, but what school boards exist that have branding in general? I've never met a school board that has a mascot.
Yeah, it's an
or am I missing something?
It's an interesting, thank you, that's a good clarification. The school board, as the governing entity of a school district with 1 or more schools, would be responsible for the branding of each of those individual schools. I will say districts have started to adopt brands. For example, I'm a big fan of logos. I'm a communications professional originally. Started out doing communications for our the legislature. I'm a big fan of Mill River SD's logo, for example, right? So some of them have started to adopt branding. I know Burlington High School, the Burlington School District is a very well-developed visual identity. when we think about this, we think about mascots though, right? So mascots are associated with schools, but the board is ultimately responsible under this law for both. So it includes both non-discriminatory mascots and school branding. And we call this out, the bill itself, I think says an act relating to non-discriminatory school branding. And you'll notice that our model policy document says mascots first, just to be really clear that, that in a lot of cases, it's the mascot that's of most concern. I mean, there might be some colors or other potential symbology used by a district that might be of concern, but generally speaking, it seems like, at least from my sort of observer's standpoint, that a lot of times the concern is about mascot. So the reason for that May 1st deadline, though, just to be really clear, is, and the law is a little bit more clear than my testimony, and I apologize for that. There was a sense that with the new policy being enforced in January and schools already in place in the school year, needing to purchase and develop new logos, potentially new apparel for sports teams, things of that nature. There was my understanding is that the General Assembly last year decided that May 1st was the deadline to select new branding for the following school year, and that they could continue to use their old materials through basically through the remainder of this school year. I think really just for budgeting and ease of transitionary purposes. That's my understanding of legislative.
Senator Weeks.
If I could, since you brought it up, the Mill River, as a Mill River graduate, I'm curious if, given the complaint, I'm not aware that they changed their mascot in the past 30 days, unless I missed something.
Sorry, important clarification. I actually don't know what the Mill River mascot is. I apologize. They issued a new school district brand mark and logo a few years ago,
Right.
which unifies kind of all of the different colors and brands of their school district. And I'm just saying from as an aesthetic perspective, I'm
Okay.
appreciative of that as an example of district branding. I
So
apologize.
that's where I'm going with
Yeah.
who adjudicates. So if the district school board doesn't object, but the individual filed a complaint, then it goes to
The
the
secretary.
agency. And then is it the secretary who ultimately adjudicates whether it is or is not in compliance?
The way the act, I'm not an attorney. The way the act is written, that's kind of the last stop in the road.
Okay.
If the secretary made a decision, my understanding of the law is that decision will be binding. I do not believe, and could check, and you probably could also ask your counsel, it's possible that a group or an individual might sue in court if they disagree beyond that. Because there's always, my understanding, again, not an attorney, is that there is a right for folks to bring suits in court in instances generally. So if someone feels harmed and they disagree with the decision, but I'm not 100% sure of that. My understanding is the intent is that really these decisions should be made at the local level. The school district should be attentive to its own policy on this and should be doing the right thing in the interests of its community and protecting its students. And then in that case, the agency acts truly as an appeals process, and ideally that would be the end of the road. I just want to note, our thought on this is to focus on the kids. And the other thing too is that it's really important. These are community conversations. We have a state where we delegate significant authority and responsibility to local school boards. We understand that they often disagree and there are responses. There are things that work for one community that don't work for others. These conversations should be held as close to the ground as possible is our perspective. And my memory of the legislative conversations last year is that that was something that was persuasive to this body and was one of the things that you were thinking about when the General Assembly was adopting this last year. I meant to ask him if he was quoting someone or not, but Secretary French was sort of telling me like, this is something where sometimes, as much as it might be a tough conversation, locals need to struggle with this. They might need to grapple with this. They need to
Learn from it.
Exactly.
Senator Weeks.
Any test cases that have reached the secretary at this point?
At this point, I think I will turn to page 3. The simple answer is that to the best AOE's knowledge, several complaints have been filed with school boards as defined in its act. Of the ones that we're aware of, The 45-day period for the board to issue a decision following the hearing has not yet run for any complaint. And as of my date of testimony today, we have not received any appeals of board decisions. So I don't believe we're aware of any board decisions. The important thing to remember is that we are sitting as an appellate entity here. So we are awaiting complaints coming to us. We have not surveyed all of the schools to see what their individual action is on this, and what we have not seen any complaints. We are aware of concerns raised by community members about individual mascots. We are aware that many of those concerns were also filed as formal complaints, and our understanding is that those are going through the process at the local level. And so that's where I would just maybe conclude the sort of
one
three
more
one.
before you conclude, Senator Field.
Yeah, or I can speak after the conclusion.
Whatever works.
All I wanted to say is that, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you like, but just say that from our perspective, we're still early in implementation. The time has not run out yet, and we are awaiting, waiting essentially complaints to come to us or appeals to come to us. And we understand that there's lots of concerns, and we frankly share the concerns. We want to make sure that students feel safe and welcomed at school. That's the ultimate goal. But the construct, again, to make sure that boards are learning and are addressing these concerns at the local level, we're not sure that the timeline has run out on that yet in terms of I did the math earlier. If someone filed a complaint on January 2nd, and the board acted immediately and scheduled a meeting, the 45 days plus an additional 30 days, which is, if you look at the two timelines outlined in policy, that's the 45 days for the board to act, and then the 30 days for the agency to receive a complaint from someone. That would have been mid-March. So that assumes a board immediately schedules something, and boards don't do that. The complaints we're aware of, I think, were filed in February. So we should be still waiting, I think, a little while once they do their hearings to receive complaints.
Thank you for this. I just want to share with the committee a little bit of my background with this. First of all, I was a librarian when we changed one of our library awards from the Dorothy Canfield Fisher Award to the Golden Dome Award, because Dorothy Canfield Fisher did have a hand in the eugenics movement way back when. And so I was happy to change the name of that award. I'm also a former rebel of South Burlington. I remember at the age of about 10 asking my mom, why is our mascot a Confederate soldier? He's got a musket and the regalia of the Southern Confederate Army. I found that odd. So I was really happy to see finally that mascot get changed. Even though they had changed it visually over the years, it wasn't quite so Confederate-y as time went on, but it was back in the 70s. I can say that the process of a community grappling, I mean, I know we're all in favor of this grappling, is really difficult. It is time-consuming, it takes money, resources, and it often divides a community, I think, for years, maybe even decades. This is not an easy thing. We love our traditions, we love our sports, we love our mascots, but some of them are just not appropriate, period. And so I'm a little, and I'm not asking for any action today, but I am a little discouraged that we don't have some like overreaching sense of ethos in this state that could really sort of help us better define or legislate a little more strongly around some of these issues. If it could save us a lot of time and energy and bad will and bad blood.
So I'll just respond, and I'd be curious before we move to Senator Hashim. So remember, what we did last year was there is a model policy now. So if you ignore it, or if you kind of handled it in a similar way, you may find that you want to amend this and somehow, I'm not sure how to make it stronger, but there may be a way if we're interested. We modeled it after the hazing, harassing, bullying policy of the state, which is there's a model policy, but we left it to local school districts to come up with theirs. They decided not to adopt one. then the state policy went into effect. And so we did hear from a lot of school children, some school board members and others last year that really compelled us to move in this direction, since it was, to Senator Gulick's point, it looked like it was challenging out there. And did some people learn? Yeah, maybe we had some kids come in and say, hey, some districts, I'm learning that the adults aren't behaving like adults, in other districts, they were really impressed by, the process. So, so there is that, but again, maybe you're thinking you want more teeth into something, and we can always have that conversation. And when we do have the NAACP in next week, to just talk about what their complaint is, maybe we'll learn something that's missing.
Yeah, I think, I hear where you're coming from, and I appreciate your testimony, Ted. I think that, I'm looking on page 2, I see, the process for handling complaints, appearing before the board to present a case, and that all makes sense. And, I'm also trying to read into this letter and distill what the asks are, or what the major points are. And I certainly don't want to assume to know or speak on anyone else's behalf, but there was one piece that struck me on the second page, about halfway down. It starts, the consequence of the resulting AOE policy now in place. Instead of placing any corrective burden on school districts, burdens individuals with expertise. And I think that the reason it struck me is that it kind of goes back to the fact that oftentimes when Black or brown people are trying to fix something that they feel is racist or problematic, it comes back around, and people will say, all right, well, if this bothers you, then go stand in front of this board and tell them why you're offended. And the thing is that it's coming from my perspective, it doesn't feel like it's right to say that it's a Black or brown person's responsibility to make other organizations do the right thing, when they should really be taking those steps themselves to fix the problem. I don't know if I articulated that as best as I could, but what I'm trying to say is that I think one of the concerns is that there's a hope that AOE can take a more unilateral approach to more promptly fix the problem. But I also do see that this timeline that's put in front of us. So I understand that the deadline is May 1st, and the process is working. But I just wanted to share my perspective on that.
I think you said it extremely eloquently, and it's something we're thinking about as well. And having read the letter that you referenced, I sense that is. I do not want to speak for the authors of that, but I understand that is often a concern. Possibly, at least I read that concern when I read the letter. What I would say is, I think that the policy that you developed, what is actually written into Act 152, is very comprehensive, and it is in line with our non-discrimination policies in the state, and I think it's pretty far-reaching. Where we are now is, again, this question of, and to Senator Gulick's point, we may end up in a year or two in a place where we do have a sort of very strong bulwark, but we are in the midst of it. And I don't know if it's early enough to say whether more is necessary. That's kind of my message, is we are waiting, but I'm sensitive to your point, Senator Hashim. What school districts should have done under the law is reviewed their policy and looked at this, it's pretty clear, and done that own self-reflection. And it's very possible that there's some that didn't. And I'm not sure, that might be something to be addressed. I'm not sure if it needs to be addressed at this point. It's something that we will. And I can't very much comment on what our process will be when we get complaints, because it's hypothetical at this point, because we haven't received one. But it's something to be looking at carefully. Did they address meaningfully whether or not they do they review as they were supposed to do with the law, their branding to ensure that it is compliant. So.
Yes,
Just Jay Nichols, BPA for the record. So I want, for the new committee members, last year when this struggle was going on, it was the first version of the bill that could have actually really hurt kids if it was implemented. And thanks to Senator Campion and other senators that were there, they listened to my testimony about it. And I think this became the kind of the pathway to try to get to where everybody thinks we should go. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, put that out there. So I think you're right. It certainly be made stronger. But it was kind of a trying to get things done. And the original bill would have had us, the BPA, saying to schools, if you don't change this, your kids can't play in sports. And we made the argument, geez, what if the 3 school board members refuse to change something we all think is offensive? Do we want to punish the kids? So I think that all kind of came into being this bill that you have today. So I just wanted to make sure that the committee members that are knew that. That's all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Something that I will just additional things to note here, which is that the process. I appreciate Jay mentioning that. The process is comprehensive in terms of the language, but the path to get there is multi-step. It does put some of that burden on districts to do the right thing. What I'll say is to the question of could AOE do more? We're here as a place to judge the facts and on the appellate end of things, to judge the facts and the basis of the board's decision and their process and the complaint. But we provide, it's on the top of front of our stuff. We provide leadership, support, and oversight of Vermont school districts. So you can look at our letterhead on the top of our. We're not necessarily the best equipped to make judgments about what is the most equitable, particularly in instances where we might have communities that disagree about what is offensive. And so having a process where the community deals with addresses the complaint, the onus is really on the board. The authority and the responsibility for Vermont schools on the school board. The onus in this bill is on the board. And I recognize that many of the advocates perceive that there's an onus on them because the complaint has to happen. But the question really is going to be, are school boards acting to address these in a manner required under law? And that's where I do think that the requirements you outlined in statute are fairly strong. There's in terms of oppression and what the branding cannot reference or stigmatize.
Yeah, just another quick thought on mascots is just that, we're giving this local control to this, this character that's probably steeped in some kind of tradition and history, but it really is an outward facing image. It's an outward facing kind of delegate or almost ambassador that is statewide. In fact, it goes beyond our state borders. We know that we have teams that compete outside of the state. I just think as we move forward, that's something we really need to think about as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I would encourage, if you haven't had a chance to look at what the mascot is, what's acceptable, take a look. Yeah,
I was just gonna,
it's a great.
off of what Senator Gulick was just talking about, it kind of actually reminds me of the continuous argument about the Confederate flag. And some people say this is for tradition. That's all it's about. But it's steeped in a very racist and white supremacist tradition. And then you have the conversation of, maybe you're flying that flag on your property, but how do you think your neighbors will feel about it if so it's kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah. So next week we'll have the lead author of this letter in on Friday. If you would ask Ms. St. James to join her, just to make sure that if we need to draft anything, but also just to get any questions, that would be great. Yes,
Thank you,
Mr.
Senator
Francis.
Chairman. Jeff Francis for the Superintendent Association. I don't have a particular comment on this discussion right now, but with your permission, I want to forward to Hayden a March 20th article from the Times Argus that talks about how the Washington Central School District is dealing with the board deliberation at this stage. It was instructive to me because it shows how the board was interacting with both the administration and the students in terms of having an inclusive process that's got, I would say, a basis in student engagement around their own education of what transpired there. It's one of the schools that's subject to it's referenced in the letter, that the mascot is the Raider. And I took note of it because, not because I have a position on it, but I was, shall we say, impressed with the reporting by the media in terms of how the school district was contending with it. So I found it useful, and you might too.
Great,
So,
that'd be helpful.
okay.
Thank you. So we're gonna leave it there. 5-minute break. We're gonna come back. We're gonna hear from Rep. Conlon. Then we have 3. I want to be respectful. We have somebody zooming in from Colorado, who I believe is on a tight schedule. So we'll take 5 minutes.